One of the things that I really want to get across to people is that multiculties don't know what multiculturalism is. Right? If you ask a multiculti, they can't, for example, if you said, well, is multiculturalism the morally better way to live? They would say, yes, of course it is. But if you then said, well, okay, pretend I'm Japanese, Japan is a monoculture, and I'm a Japanese nationalist, and I think Japan should stay a monoculture, what's your argument for proving that multiculturalism is morally superior to monoculturalism? They wouldn't have one, right? They just take it as self-evident that everything they believe must be true. And as a result, for 50 years, they've not really examined their own politics. They've not questioned and doubted and scrutinized what it is that they've been doing for the last half a century. And that's what I do in Progressing Towards the Edge of a Cliff, or at least that's one of the things I'm doing in that, right? Is to look at what multiculturalism actually is. And it turns out to be something completely different from what people believe it to be. If you look at what people believe it to be, I would date it from something that's before you were born. 1971, I bet you weren't even born in 71. But there was a Coca...
No, I wasn't.
No. There was a Coca-Cola advert that I still remember, right? Because I'd be like 8 or 9. There's a Coca-Cola advert that was really famous at the time. And you can still see it on YouTube if anyone wants to watch it, right? And it is the absolute embodiment of what people took multiculturalism to be. And this is what sold them on multiculturalism in the late 60s, early 70s, this kind of image, right? It's a group of young people, and they're of all different races, and they're standing on a green hillside, and the sun is bathing them, and it's like the Garden of Eden.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And they're all singing a lovely song. I'd like to teach the world to sing in perfect harmony. I'd like to hold it in my arms and keep it company. I'd like to see the world for once all standing hand in hand and hear them echo through the hills for peace throughout the land. Buy Coke. That was the advert, right? That was the advert. And the camera like pans across these people, and there's the smile.
So the joining factor between all of these different cultures is Coca-Cola, obviously.
Yeah, buy Coke. Yeah. Right. So like the camera pans across their faces, and there's the smiling black faces, and the smiling white faces, and the smiling Oriental faces, and the smiling Asian faces. They're all standing there, hand in hand, for peace throughout the land, all singing in harmony. And that's what people thought multiculturalism was. Now, it seems funny now, but you know, the baby boomers were hippies at the time. So this was peace and love. Right? This was good enough. This was like John Lennon's Imagine.
Yes,
you know,
yeah.
Imagine there's no countries. It's easy if you try. Well, of course you could imagine it, but it's not a political program. It's not a workable political manifesto.
Sure.
It's a pop song,
yeah.
right? And this was an advert by Coke. You know, this was selling Coca-Cola, right? But the image of it hit them right in the gut. It hit them right where they lived. That was what they wanted. This was the moral position. All these different people from different races, all standing there together in the sunshine on a hillside, singing in harmony for peace throughout the land. Right? Now, actual multiculturalism has nothing to do with that. Right? And you'll notice that that's not an argument. That's not evidence. That's a commercial. It's, like you say, it's selling a sugary pop drink. Right? And shortly afterwards, it was so popular that it became an actual pop record, a sugary pop record. In England, it was by the New Seekers, and they removed the references to Coke and just did it as a song, and it was a pop hit, you know. So that's what people assumed multiculturalism was about, and that's why they took its supposed moral superiority to be self-evident. You know, who could argue with that? People of all nations coming together in peace and harmony. You can't fault that, right? So that was good enough for them, and that's what they've believed ever since. They still believe it now. Multiculti still have that attitude now. But we need to know, because we're living in multiculturalism, we need to know what it actually is. What's the real thing, right? So that's what I'm doing in this book. What really is it? So if we want to get away from this imbecilically naive view of multiculturalism as a Coca-Cola advert or a John Lennon pop song, right? And actually examine what multiculturalism is, we can begin by just like an analysis of the word, because it's a portmanteau word. It's made of two words, multiple cultures. Multiculturalism is multiple cultures. And even that in itself is important. For example, it means it's different from multiracialism. So if we had, say large numbers of Welsh people, white white Norwegians, white Germans, and the white French moved to Poland, Poland would be a multicultural country, but it would be monoracial. It would be an entirely white country, but with multiple cultures. Same if you had large numbers of Angolans and Zimbabweans and Kenyans and Central African Republic people all moving to Nigeria. Nigeria would be multicultural, but it would be monoracial. Right? So the first thing we notice is that on a conceptual level, multiracialism and multiculturalism are not the same thing. They're only contingently the same thing in the way that multiculturalism has actually happened, because we've had large numbers of people from non-white countries moving to white countries, right? So people tend to conflate the two, multiculturalism and multiracialism, but they're not actually the same. The crucial bit about multiculturalism is the multiple cultures, right? So to achieve that, if it's 1950 England, everybody's English, more or less, right? So how do you change that into multiple cultures? You use mass immigration. Immigration isn't enough. Because if you have, say you brought 50,000 Pakistanis into England and they dispersed all over the country, they would disappear into the English and they would assimilate. And you wouldn't have Pakistani culture in England. You just have some Pakistanis whose children would grow up to be English. Yeah? You've got to have mass immigration. You've got to import populations who can create communities, so that within their community, their culture can thrive, right? And that's precisely what's happened, right? So you've got a Pakistani child now who's third generation immigrant. His father was born in Britain, but his mother was born in Pakistan, right? His grandparents were born in Pakistan. So he's someone who's born in Birmingham, whose father was born in Birmingham, but he's ethnically Pakistani, right? And that's what multiculturalism needs. Right? You've not only got to create the cultures, you've got to maintain the cultures. And that means assimilation is anathema to multiculturalism. Multiculturalism is opposed to assimilation. And again, this is an important point, because people will often say, well, can't we have a bit more assimilation? Wouldn't that be a good thing? You can't have it unless you're willing to sacrifice multiple cultures. Multiculturalism requires that assimilation doesn't take place. If you'd had, say, 1 million non-white people had moved into England, but they'd assimilated and they'd become English, you'd then have a multiracial monoculture. It'd still be a monoculture because it would be ethnically English culture. You'd just have people of different races who were English, right? And a multiracial monoculture is not the same thing as multiculturalism. Multiculturalism requires separate cultures. Yeah? So it cannot assimilate. It must not assimilate. It would be death to multiculturalism to assimilate. Right? So what they have instead is integration. And again, a lot of people think, well, integration, surely that's the same thing as assimilation. But it isn't the way that multiculties use the word. Because what they mean is the integration of cultures, not the integration of people, of individuals, but of cultures. Yeah. So for them, society is like a big patchwork, or it's like a big jigsaw puzzle, right? And you have to fit all the different jigsaw puzzle pieces together and create plural society. The community of communities. Yeah? So once you've got that in your mind, you could say, well, what does that mean then? What conclusions can we draw? If this is what multiculturalism is, that it requires the immigrant populations to remain foreign. It requires, for example, school teachers to encourage their Jamaican school children to be proud of being Jamaican, and it requires the Iraqi children to be proud of being Iraqi, and the Somali children must be proud of being Iraqi, but the English children mustn't be proud of being English, because Englishness is all about racism and imperialism and the African slave trade and all bad things, right? Because they've got to make room, they've got to make room for the multiple cultures. So what you've got is the loss of territory. Right? But what you've also got, and this is, I think, the number one shock for multiculties, what you've also got is ethnic apartheid. Multiple cultures, multiculturalism, requires that the cultures remain separate, that they can remain with their own identities. That the African Caribbean community is not the Pakistani community, and they're not the Iraqi community, who are not the Polish community. Right? In order to have multiple cultures with multiple cultural identities, everybody's got to stay separate. And what is that? Separate development is apartheid. That's what the word means. So multiculturalism is ethnic apartheid. Those two terms are synonymous. Now, if you said that to a multiculti, they'd explode. Right? And yet, if you analyze the word, that's what it means. Yeah? It also means that multiculturalism destroys the culture that it replaces. So in order for cultures to exist, they've got to exist somewhere. They've got to have territory. Yeah? So if you import culture A is 1 million people and culture B is 1 million people, right, then they've got to have homes, they've got to have jobs, they've got to have schools, they've got to have hospitals, right? They've got to live somewhere. Right? And that's how you get white flight, or what they call white flight. Right? And that's the English making room for the new cultures coming in. But multiculturalism and mass immigration is an ongoing process. It doesn't stop. Right? So, in fact, it's relentless. So what you find is that more territory is lost, and in the end, you end up with the census of 2011 showing that the white British are 45% of the population of London. The white British are now a minority. Right? And that means that London's no longer an English city. For a city to be an English city, most people who live there have to be English. For a city to be a French city, most people who live there have to be French. Right? Most people who live in London are not ethnically English. Therefore, London is not an English city. What does that mean? Well, it means that when the multiculties celebrate London as the most diverse city in the world, as they love to do. This was the big London Olympics propaganda campaign, you might remember. Right? London, the most diverse city in the world. What they're doing is they're celebrating the death of Englishness. So London is no longer an English city. Hooray! Right? And in that 2011 census, both Birmingham and Leicester were about 50-50. 50 white British, 50 not. 2011 census, that's 7 years ago now, with the speed of the demographic revolution, with this like a net migration of 30,000 a year, we can expect that now the white British in Birmingham and Leicester will also be less than 50%. And you know, if they dare to do a census in 2021, maybe they'll make an excuse and not do a census because they'll be so frightened of what the results will be. Right? But if they dare to do a census in 2021, we might expect that Birmingham and Leicester will be 45% white British. By that time, London will be 40% white British, whatever. Right? And you can actually see, not only with your own eyes, but also mathematically in the census data, the loss of territory, the loss of Englishness. This is what multiculturalism does everywhere that it's imposed. That the culture that lives there starts to die because it loses more territory and more territory and more territory. And the children of that culture are encouraged to abandon their own ethnic heritage, abandon their own ethnic culture, and embrace diversity. Yeah? And if you embrace diversity, if you're a little bit of this culture and a little bit of that culture and a little bit of another culture, you're not any ethnic culture in particular. You don't have an ethnic identity. Right? It makes people ethnically neutral. Right? And if you're ethnically neutral, you're no longer English. Right? Englishness is a specific ethnic culture, a unique and distinct culture in its own right. So another thing that the multiculties have to face up to is that their political program destroys ethnic cultures. And if we allow that ethnic prejudice is a form of racism, then that means that multiculturalism is racist. Right? And further, if we notice that multiculties only impose multiculturalism on the formerly white countries. They don't want multiculturalism in Nigeria or China or Vietnam. They want it in all the countries that used to be white countries. Yeah. Then you can see
they've had less success bringing their vision to East Asia, and also Russia as well.
Yeah.
So,
but the point is, if they target white countries, then that's an explicitly racist policy, because their policy is to destroy the ethnic cultures of white countries, or the formerly white countries. Yeah. So what the multiculti needs to be aware of is that they are the racists. It's not the people who are defending English culture who are racist. It's not the people who are defending German culture or Dutch culture or Danish culture. They're not the racists. It's the multicultis who are the racists, because their policy is a policy of destroying the white ethnic cultures.
I agree. I find it incredibly divisive and toxic on so many levels. The recent propaganda by mainstream media and policies, really, that we've been integrating into British society, but this has also been happening right across the Western world, right across Europe, and it's particularly prevalent now in Canada as well. It's been less successful recently in the USA with the election of Donald Trump, who appears to be standing up to everything that the multicultis, the globalists are saying. But I definitely agree that it's racist, and it's incredibly nihilistic in that you're destroying your own culture, and you're destroying your own history, and all of the memory of your own civilization, and all of the meaning that's really imposed onto the people, the British people now. Because I'd say if you think about culture and society in an altruistic way, then there is an expectation on the current people who live within a particular nation to ensure that that nation continues, that its cultures and traditions and beliefs carry on into the future. But multiculturalism just targets all of that and says, no, that all needs to be destroyed. All of your own history, your culture, your traditions, that all needs to be targeted, and it all needs to go.
Yeah. And it's no excuse for them to say that they personally don't care about English ethnicity, right? Because it's part of their alleged position that they respect cultures, that they respect ethnic cultures. Yeah? So even if they despise Englishness and are perfectly happy for Englishness to be flushed into the dustbin of history, right, they should still not do it, because they're supposed to be the people who respect cultures. Yeah? And as you say, this is happening all over Western Europe. It's now moved to Canada, right? That tells us something else that I think is massively important about multiculturalism, which is that it's an extremist position. They've sold us the idea that they're the moderates, right? They've sold us the idea that they're the kind, caring people. They're the great humanitarians. They're the ones who want to help all the world, right? And they present themselves in that light as if they were the nice, kind moderates. But their position is, in fact, really extremist, because it's a demographic revolution. If you perpetrate a demographic revolution across half a continent, the whole of Western Europe, there's nothing moderate about that revolution. You're changing the whole demographic profile of half a continent. And now it's, as you say, spreading to Canada and places, right? You've got Trudeau claiming that he wants Canada to be a post-national country. In other words, he doesn't want Canada
it to be a country.
Yeah, he doesn't want it to be a nation. Right? The idea that the Canadians are one people, he's against that. He's against Canadians being a nation. He wants them to just be a kind of geographical location where people come and go, and they have lots of different identities, right? Which is exactly what's happening to Western Europe, of course, right? And this is like historic on the scale of the fall of the Roman Empire, right? This is hugely historically significant. There's nothing moderate about this at all. London has been an English city for 1400 years. It's no longer an English city, and it will never be an English city again. right? This is an extremist politics. So just because they come across as being ever so nice and middle class and well mannered, that doesn't mean they're not extremists. They really are.
Yeah, it's interesting because I guess with the UK political system now, you have in both the major parties, the Conservatives and Labour, this absolute promotion of multiculturalism in both parties. I mean, there was one sign initial about in 2010, I believe, that for a few weeks, we had David Cameron and a number of other European politicians saying that multiculturalism had failed. But then very quickly they backtracked on that. And I mean, certainly in the UK, if you look at the history of it, there was relatively small levels of migration to our country leading up to, I'd say, 1997, when the Labour Party got in. And before that, it was relatively small levels of net migration, about 10 to 40,000 tops. But then after Labour got in, it shot up to 100, 200, 300,000 people in terms of net migration figures.
Yeah.
And so it's just become this colossal movement of people from all over the world into countries in Western Europe. And the movement is supported by, well, certainly in our country, by both the major political parties. And yeah, you've got the Conservatives who, aren't really doing a hell of, they're not particularly talking about this issue too much, because I guess they might offend some of the more traditional supporters of their party. But then apparently they also need to keep the, I guess, the globalist interests on board, who appear to want to turn the whole world into one country. And then on the other side of the fence, you've got Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn. And I'm not sure if you saw his speech at Glastonbury last year, where his statements on multiculturalism and on refugees and asylum seekers, what was that they were all people who had been downtrodden in their own lives, and they were looking for a place of refuge and safety in a cruel and harsh world. And to me, that just seemed to be an effort by a politician to turn international geopolitics into an episode of Barney the Dinosaur. I mean, it was so overly simplistic. It was just ridiculous. But I mean, I then looked out, in horror at all of the young British people who were attending the festival and who were, shouting out in rapture at this preaching that Mr. Corbyn was doing. And, so they have actually taken on these beliefs. And for a lot of young people, they actually believe this idea that diversity is our strength. And it's like, well, no, it's not. Diversity is just different cultures. There's nothing strong about that. There's
No, well, I mean, Corbyn's appeal to sentimentality is what I was saying about how, like, it began with "I'd like to teach the world to sing in perfect harmony." He's just doing the same thing now. Right? It's just plucking on your heartstrings. Oh, the poor people, let's let them all in, right? Cameron's 2010 thing was just a response to UKIP. I don't think Cameron changed his mind at all. I think he was just trying to win back UKIP voters, right? One of the things in what you're saying that I agree with the general sus, but I think you're underestimating the pre-1997 mass immigration. Because if you look at television programs from around 1969, 1970, 1971, and I'm talking about, well, I mean, you won't know, they're the programs I grew up with, but they're programs you won't have heard of, like Callan and Public Eye and well, just the kind of the drama detective shows of the day, as it were, right? A lot of them feature stories about immigration, because usually from a liberal point of view, right? But because it was such an issue at the time, right? So it's, people really, really worried about it in the late 60s through the 70s and the 80s. It was very much an issue. It's just that from the new Labour government onwards, as you say, it multiplied out of all sanity, right? But I mean, it was already a major issue before that.
So you think they had done the groundwork before that point in time? I guess the global corporation of government, they were moving in that direction, and then with it
was the same political project. It just wasn't moving as fast.
Sure,
right?
Sure.
What New Labour did was that they put it into overdrive. They accelerated the thing massively, right? So now, I mean, there's a thing called the Casey Review, come out in December 2016. That's unusually honest for a government-funded survey about just how ethnically segregated England now is, how the communities are all set apart from one another in their ethnic apartheid. Right? And one of the things that struck me forcefully, and I think struck them forcefully too when they were doing the Casey Review, was they asked some secondary school children in an Asian area what percentage of the UK population they thought was Asian. Right? And the answers varied from between 50% and 90%. Some of those secondary school kids thought that the UK, England and Scotland and Wales were 90% Asian. Mm-hmm. And of course, although that seems like crazy at first, once you think about it, it makes perfect sense. Because as far as they're concerned, it is. Where they live, it is 90% Asian. They go to schools that are 90% Asian. They go shopping in Asian shops to buy Asian food, to buy Asian clothes. There's no church where they live, but there's a Sikh temple and a mosque and so on. Right? From their point of view, their experience of the country called England is that it's a country that's somewhere between 50% and 90% Asian, right? Because that's their experience of it, right? And that's the level of colonization that's taken place. And I don't use the word colonization as a euphemism or as a rhetorical device or anything. I use it because it's the most literally descriptive. It's the most accurate word, right? That there are like Pakistani Muslim communities that are colonies of Pakistan. They are in England, but if you live there, like those children who think that the UK is 90% Asian, if you live there, you live in Pakistan. It's just that your part of Pakistan is called Birmingham or Leicester, right? And that's what the New Labour were after, right? There's that famous thing about Andrew Nether, who said to the Evening Standard, he blurted out that their real policy was to accelerate multiculturalism, mass immigration to such an extent that no one could ever reverse it. And then it's a fait accompli, and then everybody just has to accept it. And they succeeded. It is a fait accompli. Everybody's stuck with it now. And that's why it's important to know just how awful it is and just how much worse it's likely to get, because you can't reverse it now. The New Labour government succeeded. They got their way. You've now got a society of ethnic apartheid that's rapidly turning from multiculturalism to multi-sectarianism. In the UK, the word sectarian, we're only familiar with it really in terms of Northern Ireland, right? Where you've got the sectarian struggle, the troubles between the Protestant loyalists and the Catholic nationalists, yeah? So you've only got two identities there, two cultures with two cultural identities. And that produced sectarian conflict, violence, terrorism, yeah? Imagine a country like England will be that's got 20 cultures in it, 30 cultural identities in it, each living in their own communities, each pursuing their own cultural interest, right? Because the cultures don't agree, they don't share beliefs and values. The only thing they share is a geographical location. In terms of what this culture believes and what this culture values, opposed to what that culture believes and values, there's huge differences, right? So you've got these separate cultures living in the ethnic apartheid of multiculturalism. Over time, that's going to produce multi-sectarianism. And it won't be sectarian struggle between two cultures, it'll be sectarian struggle between 20 or 30, right? Now that the multiculturalists have done their work and they've progressed progressive politics to the point where we're all stuck with it, now perhaps they might finally get around to examining their own politics to find out what it is that they've actually done. Because I don't think the multiculturalists have a clue about what it is that they've actually done. And when they find out what they've done, they'll be horrified. Yeah. And this has been true of multiculturalism from the beginning. One of the ways I date multiculturalism in the UK is from a speech by Roy Jenkins in 1967. Now, he had no idea. None of them did. They had no idea what they were creating, right? And it was that Coca-Cola advert, right? They thought that a few people would come and we'd all get on together and it'd be lovely and we'd all live in a universal group hug and what could be wrong with that, right? If you had told Roy Jenkins that by 2011 London would no longer be an English city, by 2021 Leicester and Birmingham wouldn't be English cities either, right? I don't think he would have believed you. He would have said, well, that's just mad. You're just talking nonsense. That can't possibly happen. And yet, that is what's happened. And if that's what happened, if that's what has happened, what's going to happen next? You know? If you had told him that by the early years of the 21st century, there would be Sharia patrols on the streets of Tower Hamlets, he would have said, what's a Sharia patrol? Right? He wouldn't have known. Right? Because in the 60s and the 70s, people had no idea what multiculturalism was. Right? And that's one of the reasons why they went along with it. One of the things that people did, and this was true of me as well, was that for the first 20 years of multiculturalism, we judged it on its intentions because nobody knew what it was. Like, this was unprecedented, right? So you couldn't judge it on what it was if you haven't found out yet, right? So you could only judge it on its intentions, and its intentions were golden. Its intentions were very noble and high-minded. It was all about people living together in peace and harmony. You can't argue with that, right?
It's interesting because it's this period in the 60s, I'd say, and the 50s as well, where you have the creation of the modern world. You have, people getting fridges and washing machines and all of these other new electrical devices and I guess in the USA, people moving out into the suburbs. And then you have this massive conflict between the older traditional structures, the traditional way of life, which was obviously necessary in the world beforehand when things were a lot more difficult. And that's this conflict between them. And I'd say a lot of young people who embraced this hippie culture of, oh yeah, we just need to, just smoke weed, man, and, listen to Bob Dylan and, grow our hair long and then it moved on to move out into hippie communes and, just build a new world, man. But I think there's this incredible brattiness with that in that, that there wasn't actually a consideration of what aspects of more traditional society worked. And we see this clearly in the multiculturalism debate. There was just this this way of looking at the world of, oh yeah, man, we can do whatever we want and we can create this new world and everything's going to be great. But it's like, well, no, if you don't actually consider how things work and if you're not an actual student of history and don't look at the things that you need in order to keep your civilization running, then it's not going to be this perfect hippie utopian dream. And we've very much seen that reality become concrete with all of the multicultural policies or multiculturalist policies we've brought in.
I mean, one of the things about that generation is the incredible level of political irresponsibility. The idea that, they were young, they were fit and healthy, they could live in a tent at Glastonbury Festival with bare feet, right? But that's not so good when you're 45. It's not so good when you're 58, right? And it's not so good if you've got a society to maintain. If you're part of that hippie youth culture, then you can be very relaxed about the world, right? But if you're not part of that, you've got to deal with actually keeping people alive, keeping people housed, keeping people fed, right? The kind of boring business of actually maintaining a society. Yeah. And what makes them so politically irresponsible then and now is that they will not consider consequences. Right? So, like, you know, if you show Mama Merkel a picture of a dead baby on a beach, she'll allow an additional 1 million migrants into Germany. You're not telling me that she considered what the consequences of that would be. They make their decisions like the hippies used to, in order to feel good in the moment. What feels good now? What makes me think I'm a lovely humanitarian person? I know I'll go and welcome the refugees. That will make me feel good about myself. Right? And it's on that basis, which I think is a very feminized way to conduct politics. Right? It's on that basis that they actually conduct the politics of the Western world. It's what Justin Trudeau does. Trudeau has no notion of what the consequences of his policies would be, and he doesn't care. What he cares about is virtue signaling. What he cares about is saying, admire me, I'm a moral paragon, look what a good man I am. Right? That's what Trudeau cares about. They function on narcissism. Right? And that makes it really politically irresponsible. Because if you're going to be in charge, if you're going to have that power, you've got to exercise the responsibility that goes with that power. You've got to consider what the consequences will be. Right? And for the first 20 years of multiculturalism, nobody did that because we didn't know what the consequences were. We just judged it on its intentions. Its intentions were golden, so yeah, sign me up. Right? It was in the 90s, I think, that people started to see what multiculturalism really was. The evidence started to come in. Right? There was a film at the time called My Son the Fanatic. You can't get it now. I've tried to get it and it's not available. But it was about a first-generation immigrant whose son became a jihadi. Right? Now, of course, in the 70s, nobody knew what a jihadi was. Right? But in the 90s, now they've arrived. Yeah, because the parent is actually more ready to assimilate than the second-generation immigrant is. Right? You know. And of course, that was a very significant thing. When I was at school, the teachers were really worried about the ethnic minority kids because they thought, well, how are these kids going to fit in? You know, they live in an English England, but then they go home to a Jamaican home or a Pakistani home or an Indian home, right? And they were really worried about how these kids might grow up split. Of course, they didn't grow up split. They just kept their parents' ethnic identity and didn't become English. Right? So, and in fact, more so in the case of My Son the Fanatic, that the second generation was more of a Muslim and a Pakistani than his first generation father was, right? You know? So in the 90s, we started to become aware that multiculturalism is not what they told us it was. It's not going to turn out the way they told us it was going to turn out, right? We'd been lied to here that the promises weren't going to be kept. We weren't going to live in that Coca-Cola advert. It wasn't going to be a John Lennon pop song. It was turning into what multiculturalism really is. Right? And another thing that multiculturalists are unaware of about their own politics is that they are the colonialists, and I'll explain why. Right? They think of colonialism in terms of white people in the 19th and 20th century being imperialists, you know, stealing lumps of Africa and stealing lumps of Asia. Right? That's what they think a colonialist is. But really, a colonialist is just someone who colonizes a country. Right? That's all it means, really, colonialism. Right? Now, in the past, colonialists colonized other people's countries with their own culture. What the multiculti does is they colonize their own country with other people's cultures. But it's colonialism either way. Right? And you can see the colonies appearing. You know, that's why there are Sharia patrols in Tower Hamlets, because it's becoming a colony of Pakistan. Right?
I mean, Sharia law anywhere in the UK is. I mean, I find it utterly ridiculous that we would actually consider this is acceptable, because how the hell is it acceptable that there's a community of people from other countries and other cultures running their own legal system within our country, and it's like that's not the idea. But then I guess the leftists and the other multicultis are way beyond caring, and for them it's just become this all about virtue signalling, and yes, as you say, no consideration of the actual consequences or what has very much now become the reality of the world around, around them and around us, and now it's even worse than that, because it's just denying all of these other stories of victimization by the host nation and by say white people in the UK who are victims of various crimes and that sort of thing that have been caused by say immigrants, and also have been caused because of this promotion of apartheid, and different groups forming their own little micro cultures within the UK, and the massive tensions that are going on between the groups. We're seeing a whole degeneration of standards, and also a society that's rapidly becoming chaotic because this policy doesn't work. But then the virtue signalers don't really care a hoot about any of that.
No. You asked the question, how can we allow Sharia law, right? Now, the most important word in that sentence is we. Yeah? Because one of the consequences of multiculturalism is that the meaning of that word changes, and it changes dramatically. We're talking about a demographic revolution, right? In the book Progressing Towards the Edge, I quote a study by Professor Ted Cantle, who's actually a multiculti. That he did a survey, he did some research, and it showed that the more diversity you have, the more people become distrustful of others, and the more they kind of withdraw into their own little community, right? And of course, that's the exact opposite of what he wants to be true, right? So he actually delayed the release of this research for a while, as he tried to come up with some excuses to explain this away, right? But one of the things he says in that I think is the essence, the absolute essence of what multiculturalism is, and I quote it in the book, he says, we have to create a new us, right? In other words, we used to be the English, but in the future, we're not going to be the English. We're going to create a new us. The trouble is, multiculturalists have absolutely no idea who us are. They have no idea what we is going to become. They never did have any idea. They don't know now. They're just forging ahead into the darkness, blind, deaf, like a runaway train, towards a future, and they've no idea what future they're creating, and don't seem to care, as you say.
So to me, it seems to be that the cultures that survive are the ones that care about their own survival and make provisions for their future survival. So in the UK now, I'd argue that we're seeing an increasing presence amongst the Muslim community and also amongst the Black African Christians. And so there's, these are the cultures that actively want to survive, that are promoting traditional values, and so inevitably over time they're going to become more and more dominant. Whereas I'd say a major part of the problem, as far as the white British certainly are concerned, is that I'd say for a long time we really haven't cared about our survival and about our culture. We bought into the narrative of diversity is our strength. We bought into the ideas of empty virtue signalling and how that's somehow acceptable as a way of...
It's important to understand that this is policy. This isn't something that just happened by accident. Right? I was saying earlier about how the school teachers will encourage the ethnic minority, so-called ethnic minority kids, to take pride in their ethnic identity, but not the English kids, right? And the same thing's been done to adults, right? To endless propaganda in the entertainment industry and so on, right? And that the Western ethnic, the ethnic cultures of Western Europe, they've been encouraged to not value their own ethnic heritage, to not value their own ethnic identity. They've been told, oh, there's no such thing as Englishness. The English are a nation of immigrants. Oh, the English are just mongrels. And I disprove all of these things in the book, right? But they constantly come out with that kind of propaganda to make people say, oh, to hell with my own culture. Let's embrace everybody else's, right?
And it's so offensive because, I mean, as you show in the book, and if you just generally look back at recent history of Europe and the world, I mean, what we see is the British culture. There's some incredible foundations to that and some incredible strengths within, certainly the culture in England and Britain and in the northern European countries. And I mean, it was really our embracing of the Enlightenment values, between, say, 1500 and the 1800s. That was the bedrock, that we were able to use to build the British Empire, which created the modern world. So, I mean, that's incredibly significant.
Yeah, I mean, Englishness is one of the most important ethnic cultures that ever existed. If you think of, like trial by jury, representative democracy, things like that, liberal
Common
individualism. Law. I mean, Britain took those things around the world and spread them around the world, right? So it's not some dirty, cheap little culture that you can get rid of because it's not worth anything. It's one of the most valuable cultures there's ever been, right? But the thing about it being policy is that they actually want people to not value it. And the way I tried to describe this in the book is I use the old anthem, "They'll always be in England," right? The lyrics of which go, "They'll always be in England, and England shall be free, if England means as much to you as England means to me." Right? And this song is like, it's seen as being the typical triumphalism. They'll always be in England, that England is eternal, right? But that's not actually what the song says. It's actually a hypothetical.
Yes.
Right? It's if, right? They'll always be in England, and England shall be free, if England means as much to you as England means to me. If England doesn't mean a damn to you, if you don't care about Englishness at all, then they won't always be in England, right? That's what the song is saying, right? And of course, who are the people who don't care about Englishness? They're the multiculties. This is the generation to whom England means nothing, right? Because they've been taught to see it this way, they see England as a kind of empty vessel, and you just fill it up with any old cultures you like. The Swedes look at Sweden the same way, as if, like, Sweden isn't the country of the Swedish, it's just an area that has the arbitrary name of Sweden, and you could just fill out with whatever cultures you want, right? Whereas, in fact, reality, of course, is that the people are the culture. If you change the people, you change the culture. And the culture is the country. So if you change the people, you change the culture, and you change the country, it becomes a different country. And multiculturalists still don't seem to have wrapped their heads around that. They still seem to be struggling with this really rather elementary idea that anyone should be able to understand. And perhaps the reason they don't understand it is that they don't want to. Because if they understood that, they'd have to start changing their mind. And that they will never do.
I find it amazing as well. If recently we've seen a number of films about the Second World War, and there was the one released at the beginning of this year, Darkest Hour, about Churchill and some of the incredibly difficult decisions he had to make during the first few weeks after he was made Prime Minister, where there was severe threat of Germany coming to invade the UK and to completely wipe it out and take it over. And I mean, just the level of brutality in terms of the decisions that Churchill was having to make, and also the sacrifice that was demanded of all of these men who were fighting for the survival of British culture and British society in the face of this invasion by this incredibly evil force. And it's amazing we had that not too long ago in our history. And now what we seem to be doing is just we've given up on, the idea of promoting our culture in, ensuring that it can continue, in, trying to bring about its survival to the next generation. It seems we've given up on all of that. I mean, I'm absolutely sure Churchill would be rolling in his grave, witnessing what's happened now. And I mean, it's just this triumphalism, I guess, by sort of, yeah, I suppose that, the people who promote identity politics and this incredibly nihilistic way of running society, well, I mean, what they're doing is incredibly stupid, and far too many people have bought into the idea that it's acceptable to let them continue doing this and to actually let this happen to, Great Britain and the other European nations. And we're just suffering now for our stupidity in allowing this to happen.
I mean, the two halves of the 20th century are quite significant in this regard. Because the first half of the 20th century had two cataclysmic nationalist wars, right? I mean, real horror, though, the unspeakable horror of the World War I, followed by the even more unspeakable horror of World War II, right? So one of the things, to be fair to them, one of the things that makes sense about the early multicultures, the Roy Jenkins generation of multicultures, is that they look back at the first half of the 20th century and they say, well, we don't want any more of that, right? Two cataclysmic nationalist wars, we don't need more of that, right? So they wanted to get away from nationalism. They started seeing nationalism as a bad thing. And ever since, nationalism, at least some types of nationalism, have been associated with Nazis and totalitarianism, right? So they wanted to get away from nationalism, and that gave them a big push in the direction of multiculturalism, right? Because multiculturalism destroys nationalism, right? You cannot have a multicultural nation. In order to have a nation, the people there have got to be one people. They've got to have a national identity. They are one community. Yeah? If you have multiple identities and multiple cultures, you don't have a national identity, right? Because all you've got is the multiplicity. Right? So you can't have a nation, right? And that's why Trudeau is keen on this, right? He wants Canada to be a post-national country. They actively want to get rid of nations because they want to get rid of nationalism, yeah? Or at least the early multicultures, I think, did, right? So, in a sense...
I think that's completely misguided anyway.
Well, I'll tell you why. Right? I'll tell you why, right? Because, again, it's the difference between their intentions and the actual real consequences, right? They had the idea that if they got rid of nationalism, they would get rid of nationalist wars, and there wouldn't be any more wars, right? But what happens is not that you get rid of war. What you do is you replace nationalist war with civil war, right? Because instead of having 20 different ethnic cultures in 20 different countries, so that when they go to war, it's one nation against another nation, what multiculturalism does is it puts those 20 cultures in the same country, so that when they conflict within the same country. Right? The cultures still conflict the way they always did. It's just that now they're conflicting within one country rather than across 20 different countries. Right? So their mistake was in thinking that by getting rid of nationalism and getting rid of nationalist wars, they'd make a peaceful world. No, they won't. They just create internecine civil conflict within countries. It tears nations to pieces. Right? I don't think that you can really call the UK a nation anymore. It's got too many different identities now. There is no national identity. There's nothing that holds people together as a single people. Right? And that's what multiculturalism is all about. Multiple cultures. Right?
I'd say there's the kind of sort of misunderstanding that nationalism is the same thing as imperialism and empire building. And it's like, no, actually nationalism, in the pure sense of the word, refers to looking after your own country and your own people and ensuring they do well in their own lives and are able to seed the next generation who in 20 years' time are able to continue, seeding their particular culture. I mean, where it becomes a problem is when you get into the territory of imperialism, where, it's, we obviously are running our own nation, but we also want to be dominant on a world stage. And also, obviously, if you look at the wars of conquest in the past, there's the even more, I suppose, a draconian element of empire building, where you're actually looking at a particular nation that decides it wants to expand, and so starts expanding into other territories who obviously don't want to be assimilated by that particular nation, that society. And if we look back at human society, I think, you know, there obviously you don't have the level of technological or even intellectual sophistication that we have now, and also there's massive fight for resources. So sometimes this empire building as a way of achieving security through expansion, I guess some of it was inevitable. And, you know, you look at our history and, yeah, obviously a lot of it isn't great, but then beneath that, you've kind of got the key idea of nationalism. And that's, to me, is an incredibly important idea. And, you know, there's a lot of fantastic mythological tales that promote the idea of building your own culture and society, and keeping that going. And I just find it a very important bedrock that any society needs in order to survive. And I think that's technically true.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of political philosophy, nationalism is just one type of political philosophy. It's not good or bad, it's one type of political philosophy. And the multiculturalists actually have an equivocation in their attitude to nationalism, because they're very much against the nationalism as practiced by the formerly white countries, right? Because that's the imperialism and so on that you were talking about, yeah? But they're very keen on nationalism as practiced by the underdog. So they saw Irish nationalism as like the underdog fighting against British imperialism. So people like Ken Livingstone and Jeremy Corbyn, solidly behind the IRA and Sinn Féin. Well, I don't know whether they claim to be behind the IRA, but they would certainly claim to be behind Sinn Féin. And we can draw our own conclusions about what their attitude to the IRA was, right? But the reason that they would promote that, support that, is that they saw Irish nationalism as the underdog. They'll support Palestinian nationalism because they see Israel as the bully and then poor little oppressed Palestinians, right? So they'll support nationalism if they see it as the underdog. That's why they'll even go so far as to allow Scottish nationalism, even though most people in Scotland are white. Looks like white nationalism to me. No, they'll even allow that, right? Because they see Scotland as the underdog compared to England. And they'll allow Welsh nationalism because they see the Welsh as the underdog.
It hasn't caught on in Wales to the same extent that it did
but
in Scotland.
It's a politically respectable position, right? Whereas look at the attitude to English nationalism, right? Oh, they're a bunch of Nazis. Oh, they're a bunch of racists, right? It's absolutely forbidden to be an English nationalist, right? And that's because they don't see the English as an underdog. They see the English as one of the cultures that they despise, right?
It's a really interesting point.
I'll just finish this point. I'll just finish this point. Because with the onward progress of multiculturalism, you've already got an increasing level of English nationalism, right? And like a lot of the so-called white nationalism in this country might really be English nationalism rather than white nationalism, right? And the reason that's arising is precisely because the English are the underdog. They're the ones that the powers that be are getting rid of. You know, multiculturalism destroys the culture that it replaces. Englishness is the culture being replaced. So as you have the onward march of multiple cultures, the English are the English resistance. They're the nationalists who are fighting back against the powers that be. But the current powers that be can never see it that way, right? So they'll actually destroy the genuine underdog because they're not allowed to see the English as an underdog, right? And if they did see the English as an underdog, they'd have to admit what multiculturalism really was. And they're not going to do that, right? So it doesn't allow them to see the English as an underdog, right? But it's interesting that normally they support underdog nationalism, but not in this case because they can't, right? In the same way that if the Dutch nationalists start fighting back against multiculturalism in the Netherlands, they're not going to see the Dutch nationalists as the underdog fighting against this great roller coaster, this huge, great steamroller of multiculturalism that's crushing their culture. So that'll be an interesting thing to watch out for in the future, I think.
I wanted to mention there's going to be, I saw, it was at my work, and I've seen it at a number of workplaces, a lot of leaflets for, I think they want to turn this into one of the major protests this year, and it's a stand up to racism protest. I think they're trying to do it in various cities across the UK. And so on the leaflet, they discuss the problems of Islamophobia, and they automatically conflate that to racism.
Yeah.
They also talk about the problem of Donald Trump as well, and so they automatically conflate that to racism. And so, interestingly, I see a parallel between this particular protest, which I'm guessing will receive a hell of a lot of central funding from extremely rich individuals and powerful organisations. I see a lot of similarities between this protest and the recent women's protest against Trump. And so with that one, there were lots of women wearing vagina hats and vagina costumes, placards saying Trump needs to go, other placards saying that we need open borders, and various other ideas that seem to be promoting this globalist agenda, which is fairly clearly laid out, saying George Soros's Open Society Foundation papers of multiculturalism, open borders, all of this virtue signalling that we're talking about, massive promotion of identity politics. And it was exactly the same emphasis on at the women's protest that there is being placed at this new Stand Up to Racism protest. And so, I mean, my problems with this one in particular are, I mean, I've got to say that, in the mainstream media and the new political left have, I just feel they've completely murdered the word racism, and they've just reduced any, they've just destroyed any actual context that you can apply to the word, because, they're now appropriating it and using it in situations where people are criticising usually the ideology of Islam, and certainly Trump has done that, and all of these people that they accuse of Islamophobia, I guess the new words, the new version of heresy, and so it just seems as though they're trying to use this word racism, which used to have a negative meaning, and then they're using it to attack everyone who doesn't fit into their narrow political ideology.
These are not thinking people. These are Pavlov's dogs.
Yes.
Right? Their whole politics is made of dog whistles, where none of them actually examine what they actually believe to see if it's solidly constructed, whether they can justify what they believe, because they don't feel any need to justify their beliefs. They think that their correctness is just self-evident, right? So, I was saying earlier that multiculturalism is a political program that destroys ethnic cultures. It's therefore a racist political program. So we could stand up to racism by standing up against multiculturalism, because multiculturalism is racist, right? Now, if I presented that argument to a multiculti, they would just blow raspberries at me, right? They would have no counter argument. They would not tell me why I was wrong. They would not analyze what I've said and spot flaws in it. They'd just ridicule it, right? They just snort in derision, right? Because they have no arguments. These are people who just think what they're told, right? These are cattle, really, right? They're sometimes called sheeple, right? Because they're sheep, right? They all bleat together, and they all bleat what they're told to bleat, right? But if you look at Islamophobia, so-called, how did that suddenly become a thing? Someone might ask. Dave Cullen might say, how did that suddenly become a thing, right? But why is the multiculti attitude so different to Islam than it is to, say, Christianity or Judaism or any of the others, right? And there's two aspects to that. They associate Judaism and Christianity with white people. Now, Christianity is not a white religion. There's lots of black Christians in America, lots of black Christians in Africa, but they associate it with white people, right? So they see it as a white religion. Therefore, you can criticize it to your heart's content, right? But they associate Islam with non-white people because most Muslims are what they would call people of color, right? Therefore, you're not allowed to criticize it, especially if you're white. Because if you're a white person criticizing Islam, you are a white person criticizing the culture of non-white people. You are criticizing something that people of color believe, right? And that's why they declare it to be racist. I mean, I think even they understand that, like, Islam is not a race. I think even they know that. But they don't care because they associate the religion with people of color. So if you criticize it, you're criticizing people of color, and that's racist. Right? So their Islamophobia is just a proxy for racism as far as they're concerned. But of course, all of that is based upon ideas of what racist people are, attaching colors to religions, thinking that Christianity is the religion of the white people, thinking that Islam is a religion of people of color. It's all based on their attitudes to race. Right? So the whole thing is their racism, right? They are the racists. They're judging everything by what race people are. They're not looking at Christianity and saying, oh yes, we can criticize this in lots and lots of ways. And then they look at Islam and say, oh, we can criticize this one too in lots and lots of ways. I mean, Islam ought to be everything that the advocates of identity politics hate, right? It's imperialist, it's supremacist, it's homophobic, it's anti-Semitic, it's everything. They ought to loathe Islam, right? The only reason they constantly defend it is because most Muslims are not white. Right? It's purely their racial attitudes and the racial double standards that multiculties have that cause them to defend a right-wing ideology that's got a large fascist wing called jihad, right? And they will defend it because, well, they're mostly people who are not white. And therefore it must be defended. Not because of the religion or what the religion believes or because it's a religion of peace, but simply because of the color of most Muslims. Right? So in other words, their position on Islamophobia is entrenched in their own racism. Yeah? But again, if you put that argument to one of these cattle, what would they reply? Right? They would have no counter-argument. They'd just call you names.
They've got labels, haven't
yes,
they?
They'd engage in...
that's one of their prime labels.
They'd engage in the
racist.
Politics of name-calling.
Yes.
Because they are 5-year-old children and name-calling is all they've got. Yeah.
So yeah, Islamophobe, obviously the new in vogue one. Yeah. Nazi, fascist,
far right,
alt-right.
Yeah. White supremacist is the one they use the most these days. That's their
White
new one.
Supremacist.
They use that a lot because that's only been introduced quite recently, right? So that's still got a bit of freshness to it. So they like to use that one.
Throw in the occasional misogynist. Yeah. Why the hell not?
The leader of Black Lives Matter in Canada said that Justin Trudeau was a white supremacist.
Right.
So apparently, if you're a white supremacist, that means you've got the same politics as Justin Trudeau.
Right, yeah.
In other words, anybody and everybody that she doesn't like is a white supremacist. They use the words without any literal meaning. The language they use, the vocabulary they use has no meaning whatsoever. I mean, a good example of that is hate speech. People think that hate speech must be when you say things that are hateful or express hatred. Not at all. Hate speech is just a political tool. It's a way of saying, I can suppress your freedom of speech whilst claiming that I haven't suppressed your freedom of speech. Right? So they say, well, freedom of speech doesn't cover hate speech. Hate speech is not included under freedom of speech. And everything you say is hate speech. So everything you say can be no platformed. Everything you say. In fact, everything all of our opponents can say can all be suppressed because it's all hate speech, but we can still claim to support freedom of speech because freedom of speech doesn't cover hate speech. You know, that's what it is, right? It's just a tool for silencing the opposition. It's just a way of saying, I can shut your mouth and still claim to support freedom of speech. Right? It has nothing to do with who's speaking hatred. If it did, it would apply to them.
Do you think that there's, I mean, if you look at the situations where, say, hate speech laws might be more altruistically enforced, so for instance, you have someone who has a political platform and they're saying we must murder these people, we must slit their throats and rape their women.
Yeah.
Let's march now. Do you think there's a need to use these laws in that situation?
Yeah. Well,
but then it kind of gets misapplied after that, and it's applied to all people who start criticizing another group of people, or or women, or
the kind of philosophical problem with hate speech is that you're talking about a person's emotional motivation, and how do you establish that in a court of law? Right? It's very difficult because it goes on inside their head, right? How do you establish their emotional motivation? And there are cases where you think, well, that's really clear. If someone's saying gas the Jews or something, well, come on, that's hate speech, right? And it is, right? No question about it. That's hate speech, right? But the trouble is, you'll get people who deny it. So can you prove it if they deny it? And the example that comes to mind instantly, of course, is that for 50 years, feminists have been slagging off men, slandering men, insulting men, ridiculing men, deriding men, degrading men. They've heaped opprobrium on men every single day for half a century. But if you say to a feminist, you're a man-hater, she will immediately respond, feminists don't hate men. Right? After 50 years of relentless abuse, they're still claiming that they're not motivated by hate. Right? So if someone, it seems to me that feminism is a hate movement against men. There's no question about that. It's so obvious, right? But if the person engaged in the hate movement flat out denies it, the way feminists do, how do you prove it? Right?
Yeah, I suppose I guess my feeling on specific hate speech laws is just when it comes to this point where you are promoting a call to violence against other groups, I think that can be a very negative activity. And certainly, if it's someone who, say, is an established member in the community and they're appealing to younger people who are more naive in the ways of the world, you've got a very dangerous situation there.
I mean,
so
that's how
I am against that. But anything else, really, even what the feminists do, I mean, my problem with them is their ability to control policy making as well, because that's when their words start to develop teeth.
I mean, the situation you were just describing is the way things used to be. There was a law against incitement to violence.
Yes.
Right? If you've got a law against incitement to violence, you may not need a hate speech law, then, right? Because especially if you're an advocate of freedom of speech, because firstly, what is or is not hate? That's that's going to be entirely subjective, right? The things that I consider to be hate mongering, the hate mongers don't believe to be hate mongers, right? They'll accuse me of it, and I'm accusing them of it, right? And neither of us agree, right? So trying to establish what hate is very difficult, but incitement to violence is clear enough. And so that was the English way, that was the English law, right? That you could say what you wanted, more or less, but if you advocated violence, then you went to prison.
Yes, I think that's a useful way to actually police freedom of speech, because then you actually allow for freedom of speech at a very general level otherwise. But now it seems the problem is that they're taking the idea of criticising a certain group and they're saying, oh, well, that's hate speech too. So now you can't engage in any criticism.
No.
Well, if you're not able to engage in any criticism, clearly you don't have freedom of speech, and also you don't really have a society that's able to recognise any faults certainly with this new multiculturalist movement and with the feminist movement earlier. And I mean, that seems to be the mentality of it, is that they like to promote, obviously, the oppressed group, and if you look at a lot of workplace policies, they'll say that these people have protected characteristics, and so those are the groups who you can't criticise.
Everything other than cisgendered straight white males is protected. No, but I mean, what you're saying really, it touches upon the difficulty of this, not just the moral difficulty, but the legal difficulty, the intellectual difficulty of this. Because we might say, for example, that it's right to have a law against slander. Slander is a form of harm against another person. So if I accuse you of being a child rapist, right, that's a dreadful insult. And you know, if people thought it was true, that would destroy your life,
yes,
right?
Yeah.
So you can then sue me for slander, and I go to prison because you're not a child rapist. I've slandered you. Right? On the other hand, feminists will want a hashtag #MeToo situation where you can destroy any man's life by saying he touched my bum. 20 years ago, he grabbed my tits. That's his life destroyed. You know, and they're not worried about whether the men are being slandered, right? These things haven't come to court yet. Nobody knows what the truth is. The man's life is destroyed long before there's any kind of slander case, right? And similarly, when it comes to something like, say, Donald Trump, people have accused him of being a Nazi. Now, to me, that's slander, right? Trump is not a Nazi. He doesn't hold Nazi beliefs. He doesn't follow Nazi policies. If you look at the political program of the Nazi Party and the political program of Donald Trump, they've got nothing in common. They're completely different. Right?
There's no way he would have become the president of the USA if he was an actual Nazi.
And
if you know, during his campaign speeches, he had started delivering his speeches in front of a swastika rather than in front of the American flag, and started going on about how he loved Hitler. Quite clearly, if he had done any of that, there's no way anyone would have voted for him. It's utterly ridiculous.
And also, if you just look at what he believes, he's not advocating eugenics or anything, right? I mean, you just look at his political program. It's not a Nazi political program. It's a terrible insult to call the man a Nazi when he isn't one, right? Now, so I would call that slander, and yet people get away with that every single day.
Yes,
right? So on the other hand, if Trump says, well, you know, having a mass illegal immigration from Mexico has some very bad consequences, he'll be denounced as having been guilty of hate speech. Oh, that's hate speech against the Mexicans, right? He's slandering the Mexicans, right? So part of the problem with this is that people can't be reasonable about it. They can't be, you know, they're not grown-ups anymore. We've got this infantilized society where it's all about whether you're one of the good people who throws the correct labels of derision at people, or whether you're someone who's on the other side, right? One of the bad people, right? And for as long as we have that kind of infantile society, then society doesn't work properly. You know, having things like laws against slander don't work anymore because the people are acting in too childish a way. You know? You've got to have grown-up people to have grown-up laws. I mean, they're really not much more than fashion slaves. You know, a fashion slave will say what other people are saying because other people are saying it. It's called slang, right? You know, they'll wear what other people wear because other people are wearing it. Right? That sartorial fashions and so on, right? And you get intellectual fashions and so on. And none of them are doing any thinking for themselves. None of them have come to an opinion through their own free thought, independent-minded free thought to come to what their opinion is. They're just going along with the herd, you know. So that's why they all use the same language, and that's why when someone tries to interview them and say, well, why are you here? They can't speak coherently into the microphone, right? They don't know why they're here. They're here because everybody else is. Right? They're here. I came because my friend came, right? You know, I mean, these are the people.
I very much found this to be the case when I went to the Women's March last year and just tried to interview a number of the people there about what their actual what the actual aims of the day were.
And they have no idea, right? They're just following along with the herd. I mean, at the Women's March, I mean, since the 70s, feminists have been complaining that men view women as nothing but sex objects. They're just a vagina on legs, right? They've been complaining about this for years, right? And then you look at the Women's March and they're wearing vagina costumes. They are literally a vagina on legs, right? You know, and this wouldn't occur to them, right? It wouldn't occur to them, maybe this is not a good costume to wear, right? You know, because they don't do any of their own thinking. They just, whatever anybody else is doing, that's what they do. Right? And so I don't take them seriously at all. I mean, they're politically important simply because they're so numerical. There's such a large number of them, right? But in terms of political analysis and understanding the politics of the day, they have zero to contribute. They have nothing at all to contribute. They'll just stand on a stage and say, "Rock against racism, yeah," or whatever, right? Which is meaningless sloganizing. Yeah.
Yes, I just wanted to say again, with progressing toward the edge of a cliff, that another fantastic book that does take a microscope to this issue of multiculturalism, and shows the utter failure of multicultural societies. And it shows that, you know, we're on an extremely dangerous trajectory here. And there's pretty much nothing we can do about it now. It's the damage has been done, the floodgates have been opened, and
remain open.
And remain, right? Yes.
No one's, even if, like, we're in, let's say for the sake of argument, we're in the process of getting out of the EU, right? Well, during that process, the borders are still open. After that process, there's no guarantee that there'll be secure borders after that. Even once we're out of the EU, we may have open borders, right? You know, you just got to remember the idiots who are in charge, right? Those idiots remain in charge. It's not like we're going to get a new political class with a bit of sense, you know. So this is an ongoing process. One of the things that needs to be understood, and I think I said this last time, right? That in order to understand your position, you don't just have to know how you got here and where you are. You need to understand where you're going, right? And given that multiculturalism is in itself ethnic apartheid and multi-sectarian, and it's becoming increasing all the time, right? That, regardless of whatever else happens, you know, regardless of what happens to the economy, regardless of what happens regarding feminism, just that in itself is taking you in a very dark direction. You know? And I'm old, I'm going to be dead in 10 years, it won't matter, or I'll be gone, right? But the young people, they're going to have to live in it. And I think they're going to
or move.
Well, move to where, though? Can they move to Canada? It's going to be the same in Canada.
Yes.
Can they move to Australia? Well, it'll be the same in Australia. You know, can they move to Europe? Well, Europe will be the same. I mean, they could move to Poland, but you know, you can't have everybody living in Poland, right? Poland can't take the whole white population of planet Earth, right? So, I mean, where are they going to go if it's the same all over, right? And they're going to find, and also, you know, if you're very poor, it's harder to move. And like in 40 years, maybe they'll be the refugees. Maybe they'll be the ones seeking asylum because the Western world have been dragged down so far. Now, they'll just laugh at that, of course. They'll say, well, that's just ridiculous scaremongering. But if we learn from history, then we should look back. I mean, one of the things I do in the book is I look at Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech. I don't look at the whole of his career or anything like that, right? But I just look at that one speech because that's the infamous one, right? That's the racist scaremonger one. And if you look through it, not only is he remarkably prescient, I mean, his guesses for the future are really accurate. But if anything, he understates how bad it's going to get. You know, if anything, he's underestimating.
No, anyway.
No, and it's amazing he was as accurate as he was because he's talking like 30 years in the future. He's talking in 1968, right? So, I mean, we know from the past that the things that people, you know, like Roy Jenkins would never have believed that London would cease to be an English city, right? We know from the past that they would not have believed what was going to happen, right? So if people today don't believe that that could possibly happen in the future, right? If I make a prediction for the future and they say, oh, that's impossible, well, that's what they said in the past and it came true. Right? So if people said it was impossible in the past and it came true, then what people are saying today is an impossible future may in fact be the future. You know? And the young people, of course, will have to live in it. And I don't envy them that.
Yeah, no, I was speaking to, it was this one woman recently, and she was saying that, oh, well, you know, with all of this multiculturalism, yeah, we are getting away from Britain as a predominantly white nation, and so the effect of this will just be that, you know, we'll all just become a blur, you know, a sort of, I guess, kind of a half-caste mongrel type country, and it's like, I personally, you know, don't believe that's going to happen at all. I just see the increasing dominion of particular cultures that care for their own civilization, their own society, and you know those will be the ones that triumph. But for a lot of the European peoples, you know, we've got open borders, we've got open movements, around Europe, and it just seems to be that it's a lot of young European people who are just gallivanting around the continent and are in ever dwindling numbers. And their societies are diminishing in terms of population and in terms of influence. And really, I think we're just going to see the increase in terms of the communities, the Islamic community and the Black African Christian community, because they actually care for their own cultures. Yes.
And what happens when they conflict? Right? Because they're in direct opposition to one another.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Jesus is Lord. No, he isn't. Right? I mean, they're in direct opposition to one another. And I think you're absolutely right. That the cultures that survive will be the least multiculturalist.
Yes.
They'll be the ones that are most internally coherent and keep themselves to themselves. Especially if they've got numbers. Right? So if it's the cultures within multiculturalism who are the least committed to multiculturalism, the ones that are most concerned about their own culture and to hell with everyone else's, if they're the ones, because they've got unity within their own culture, if they're the ones that are most likely to survive, the ones that are least likely to survive are those who embrace diversity, those who are the multicultis, right? Because they have no unity amongst themselves. They don't even have an ethnic identity, half of them, right? So, as things progress, I think it will probably be the cultures that you and I would least want to be the inheritors of the future, who are actually the inheritors of the future, right? Unless, the Dutch get off their arse and the English get off their arse and the French get off their arse and actually start doing something about trying to defend their own ethnic cultures before they become extinct. Right?
Yeah, so in terms of an actual projection for the future, can you see that happening? Or do you think, say, the people of Europe, a lot of the indigenous people have just fully embraced their nihilism and the destruction of their own civilizations now?
I think the crucial evidence, so far anyway, regarding that question, is the Rotherham sex scandal. Right? At any time in human history, anywhere on planet Earth, if an ethnic minority immigrant community had been preying upon the pubescent girls of the ethnic majority community, there would have been hell to pay, right? I mean, it would have been extremely violent, right? Anytime, anywhere in the whole of human history, right? But not only was there no kind of retaliation or reprisals to Rotherham, there weren't to Newcastle or to Oxford or to Rochdale or to any of the other Muslim rape network things, right? So that looks to me like a culture that's given up the ghost, right? Yeah. If you don't protect pubescent girls who are being taken as rape slaves, what are you going to protect? What is there about your culture that you're willing to fight for if you don't fight for 13-year-old girls being turned into rape slaves? I mean, really, it's not so much the rape networks that's it is shocking, but what's even more shocking is the total lack of kind of reprisal or retaliation. The fact that people just said, "Oh dear, that's awful," and then got on with their daily business. Any culture that can just absorb that is a culture that doesn't really want to survive, right? But there'll be people within that dying culture that will want to maintain their own ethnic culture. So, I mean, because I tend to sound a bit defeatist when I'm on this subject. Right? So, just to end on a positive note, if you want to do something about this, what you need is to promote the English culture, promote English ethnicity, because the multicultis will carry on slagging it off for all they're worth, right? So people need to start talking up English ethnic culture. They're talking about what's good about it, what you might value about it, why you might want to preserve it, why you want it to continue to be a living ethnic culture, rather than just casting it into the dustbin of history. And to do that, you need English people, so you need English communities. So one of the things I think that might occur, well, I don't know if it will, it might occur, in future, is that white flight becomes, as it were, the English communities. You start getting, in the same way that in this area of Birmingham, everybody is Pakistani and they've got their own territory, that the white area will start to become an English area, and they'll start wanting to assert their own ethnic identity in that area. That might allow Englishness to continue into the future. I only say might. Whether it actually happens or not, I don't know. If it doesn't, then Englishness will die.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So that's yeah.
Back to the defeatism.
A nice, defeatist note. But there we are. Well, it is a horrific situation, and I think we need this actual defeatist attitude at the moment, because that's the most productive attitude to have right now. If you want to do something about it, then you need to be shamed and humiliated into realising the absolutely colossal mistake that your culture has made. So,
my goal is simply to tell the truth, right? So I'm doing it in all my books. I'm just trying to say, well, this is how it really is. Yeah. Now, if the truth turns out to be something that's really dismaying, and you think, oh God, this is a cause of despair, well then maybe that will shake people up and might get their brains functioning, and they might actually start doing something, you know.
I've been talking today to JP Tate. You can check out his books on Amazon. I'll leave a link in the description. Thank you. Have a good day. Bye-bye.